Hello, welcome back again. So we made some progress. I've been working on the AI this time. I've only been programming this whole week. It was a mess. First of all, I have like 13 hours of footage and like 2 hours of footage was usable, so I sped things up. Still got a lot of parts out, so it was a week. Let me tell you that. So yeah, I decided to take a little break from the art creation thing, like Blender and stuff. Even though I love it, I think it was time to focus a little bit on a prototype, so we have something to work with. And the result is basically we have a working enemy AI, very basic, nothing major yet. It still doesn't kill the player, it only follows the player. And that's basically all we've done. It doesn't sound like much, but it did a lot. So, starting from the beginning, I was like, why not make walking a little bit more fancy? So I tried implementing a sprinting function. I did that because walking was slow, and it should be slow as well. But yeah, I basically created a sprinting function. Very basic, just when you hold the button, you go like double the speed. When you release the button, you go back to the walking state, like the normal walking speeds. So then when we had the sprinting done, you know, maybe it's fun to have some like head bobbing effect, like if you're walking the camera goes up and down. It's more natural to walk, basically. Like now we're walking, we're basically floating. It feels weird, even though it feels like walking, but you get the idea. So I tried implementing a head bobbing effect, even though it sounds very easy, it's not very easy. So I basically started a simple blueprint script in the player controller, and I basically put like the vector up location, like the z-axis vector up location, and was just putting that up and down in a timeline, but it kept messing up, and yeah, it didn't work properly. Oh, I did so much iterations of the basic code I had, and it was just it sucked. It plain sucked. That's it. There's nothing to tell you there. So I looked it up, like how can you do a head bobbing effect? Read the documentation, and there was an option or a function blueprint called camera shake. I'm like, oh, that's easy. If you can implement that and just play the camera shake in the script, that would solve it, right? Yeah, that's what I would have thought, but there is supposedly a simple camera shake option in the blueprints, but I didn't have that. I only had camera shake base and all the other garbage, which didn't work. I used that. It had the same settings as the normal camera shake, but I couldn't call it in the script. There was no play camera shake option in the script, nowhere to be found, and that was in the documentation. So I watched the video from someone else. It was only 4 months old, and it was the exact same engine version I have, but yeah, he had the same thing as like the documentation, and still didn't work for me. So I went back to the drawing board. I was like, okay, so the original thing doesn't work for me. I can accept that, it's not always easy. So I started creating my own little iteration of the code. So what I did, I took the movement, I put it into a branch, a boolean. So if it was true, I would set the vector variable to head bobbing up. That went through a timeline, which is basically a graph where I put a vector on the z-axis, which goes up and down, and I'm back to the basic state, and I loop that. So we're walking, and then it should be going up and down, but then the movement got stuck, and the camera was just going up and down. So that was fun. Yeah, it doesn't work. After everything I did, it still didn't work. I spent like at least 2 hours so far on it, and it still didn't work. So I had so many iterations, and one iteration was I spawned and I would get stuck at world origin, so outside of the map, and when I looked to my left there were trees and was just floating in the air without doing anything basically. So that was weird. Then the second one, it just didn't do anything, so I could just walk around without any real effects. 2 times I actually flew into the air, just very high. Once it was just straight up into the sky, and the second one was flying up into the sky and rotating while spinning. It might make you nauseous though. Well, I know for sure it will make you nauseous if that was the movement, so that didn't really work. And hey, we saw the stars, so that was fun little testing, right? It wasn't. So after like 3 hours, well, hours of trying to make it work, I decided to drop it and come back to it at a later stage, and do some research in between for the camera shake function, since I still believe that's bugged. I don't think it's in the documentation, and it is very different for me, so that feels a little weird, you know, even if multiple different tutorial videos do the same thing as the documentation and I just don't have that option. Doesn't matter how recent the videos are, it's not there, and that's very frustrating. Okay, I'm not a code genius, so I can't just script it myself, as you probably have seen from the test results. So yeah, I decided to drop it after like 3 hours and a full day of work. Well, 3 hours. I have normal work, and then I have evening game dev work, and that's basically like 2 to 4 hours a day, depending on how much I actually do and how much works. That's the most important thing. If it doesn't work, I lose interest, but I also want to make it work. So yeah, I spent 3 hours out of the 4 just trying to fix it, but oops, didn't work. So yeah, after the head bobbing, I was like, let's make that prototype, okay? Let's just make a simple version and try and get the AI working. Just very simple, not really into details yet, just the teleportation to the player. It's the only thing I really want. As of now, at least, I created a simple script which basically sees how many collectibles are left. And if there are 7 collectibles left, the enemy gets spawned. For testing purposes on the player location, just to start with. And that kind of worked. Not really. As soon as I hit play, the enemy was right in front of us. And when I tried to move, it spawned all around us. So it kept spawning every second. I put in the event tick, so it gets played every frame, so that made sense. So I put a branch in between, a boolean. So as soon as there are only 7 left, it goes into the boolean. So is that true or is that false? Well, if it's false, if there are 8 left, it doesn't get played. The enemy doesn't get spawned. But if there are 7 left, the enemy gets spawned, and that worked. It only spawned when I picked it up, but it still kept spawning all around me multiple times. So I had to get back to the drawing board again. What I did was very simple. I just put a do once node in between, which basically executes the code only once. And that fixed the problem. It just spawned on top of me one time, and that worked. I got the enemy to spawn in properly on my location. That will change in the future, but just for now. I was pretty happy with that. So now it was time for the teleportation system. So I created simple code to just spawn the enemy every 3 seconds. So I basically got the player pawn, which is us, the player, and I got the location of it. I executed every frame, so we get the location of the player every frame. Then we put a delay on it, and that delay is going into the teleport system. So the AI basically constantly teleports to the player every 3 seconds. But it didn't do anything, so back to the drawing board. So what I did then, I basically looked if the capsule component, basically the enemy itself, was active. And if it was active, put a delay on it for 3 seconds and then teleport it towards the player. But then it didn't spawn at all. Even if I picked up a collectible, it just didn't spawn anymore. That was frustrating as well, because I didn't have a clue what I did. Even after deleting the code, it still didn't spawn again. So I had to recreate the code. It was very simple, but still, I had to recreate it. But it took me 45 minutes to fix the spawning, actually. So I don't really know what happened, still don't, but recreating the code worked. I also changed up the teleportation script, and now the enemy spawns on top of us, but randomly. It doesn't really clamp itself to the 3 seconds, so it's just random. And it only teleports to like the positive axis, so you know, you have like XYZ. If that's 0, that's world origin. If it's going to the plus side of that, it teleports. But if it goes to the negative side of that, in this case the left side of the field, it just doesn't spawn there. So that's another problem to fix. And it's inconsistent, so 2 problems to fix. And then with testing, I found out there was a 3rd bug, and that's the fact that it stops spawning after a while. Like, it keeps teleporting after a while. So it teleports like 3 or 4 times and then just stopped. Doesn't matter where I am. Even if I am at the positive axis, it just stopped completely. So it wasn't as easy as I thought it was. So basically, after 2 hours of struggling again, I decided to change up the teleport system, since it's just not working randomly like that. So I decided to go with teleport paths. So I just create an actor, which is going to be invisible later on, but now it's just a sphere, which is visible. And I create a little script to calculate the distance between the player and the teleport paths. And after a few seconds, with a delay on it, the AI or the enemy teleports towards that specific path, so it can't spawn on random places anymore. It can only spawn on those specific actors, and that kind of worked. Not really as much as I wanted to, but it goes to the paths after a while. On the delay works as well, but it only goes to the first entry of the array. The array is like a list, so if you have like 4 paths in the scene, basically 0, 1, 2, 3. 0 is the first path I put into the scene, so it basically only goes to the first one, nowhere else. So it's stuck there, and it doesn't calculate the distance properly. And if I delete the first one, it just goes to the second one, because that becomes the new first one in the array. So yeah, that was like 2.5, 3 hours of work, and I basically only had the enemy spawning in properly, and that's all that worked properly after 3 hours. But I got a solid idea, and I wanted to actually make that work. I made a debugging thing. So we get the number of the array we are closest to, and we print that to the console. So in the game, you see on the left side there are like numbers, and that's the number of the array we are closest to, and that's where to see if the enemy actually recognizes the spot we are at and teleports to it. But as you can see, the range is not very high. We have to really be on the spot, on the actor. It doesn't calculate it when we're on the in the middle of the room. It doesn't calculate which one we are closer to, only when we're actually on it. So the range is very low, as well as the AI is on top of the pad. It doesn't recognize it's occupied, so it doesn't calculate the next closest one. So if you're at a pad, he still calculates like that's the closest one, so he keeps teleporting on the same spot. So that's also something we don't really want. So just to make it easier for myself, I cleaned up the code, created some functions, and I was thinking about, again, another iteration. And this one is a little more for the balancing from later on. It's better to do it now, even though the system is not really working that well, just to make it easier to implement it. If you do it later on, it will probably break the code or something, I don't know. So it's better to do it now than later. So basically, the enemy spawns in on a specific location when we get the first collectible. Then after a set of seconds, probably in a timer like between 8 and 13 seconds by example, on a random number within that range, it teleports to the closest one to, next to the player. Then it teleports back to the same spot, and just so it's away from the player, so the player doesn't really have the enemy in their face all the time. So that's to keep the tension off a little bit and to make it also a little bit more creepy. So the player is not constantly running and freaking out because they can see the enemy coming towards them. So I implemented that, and that actually worked pretty well. I added it to the random teleport thing, and it actually kind of worked well. It went to the base pad. I called it the base since it's the one spot it keeps going back to. So it spawns on the base, it goes to the player, it spawns back to it teleports back to the base, then teleports to the player, then teleports back to the base, and so on and so on. So that actually worked pretty well, even though the teleporting towards the player doesn't work, but it kept teleporting back and forth, and that's at least something. So I was actually surprised it worked that well. So the only thing I really had to fix now was the way the enemy calculates the distance between the player and the pad, and to know where it should teleport to. It was a little too precise now, and I don't really want that. I don't want like 100,000 things on the map which don't really have that much distance. So it's just too random that way, and just too precise. I want a little bit of distance. So I went on some forums. I read a little bit about enemy behavior, calculating distance between two objects, actors in this case. And I basically got little bits and pieces from different parts of code. I just hoped for the best, basically. I stitched a lot of things together, added my own little twist to it, since it's very specific, the things you find on the internet. For just that person, like one person has troubles with something, they ask a question and other people provide the solution or a part of the solution. I just got like pieces from 4 different solutions basically, and I basically had to make that my own. So that was a fun challenge. I actually got it working. So yeah, I created the function, I put in the enemy AI, and I tested it. It calculated properly and it teleported to the pad, but only once. So it kept teleporting in a loop. So if I was closest to the first one, it kept going to the first one and back to the base path, and it just kept doing that. When I went to the third one, it just went to the third one, back to the base, back to the third one, no matter what. So it only calculated the input once, or the distance once. So that was very frustrating, since again, it was like a few hours in already. So after 1.5 hours, yes, 1.5 hours, I was just trying to fix it. There's only one thing I had to do, and that was basically a little line from the distance node. So you basically got like the 2 inputs from the locations that goes into a distance vector node, which basically calculates the distance between the two. And I didn't return that value to distance variable. So there wasn't really a nearest distance being calculated and put into the script. So yeah, that took me 1.5 hours to fix, just draw a line. Even though it's visual scripting, you have like the normal programming where you just forget like a semicolon or something. I basically forgot to draw a line, and that took me 1.5 hours, and it was very frustrating when I found it out. So I tested it again, and it actually worked like a charm. I was so happy. You can also see like the camera shake in the test. So I had to create like comments to come back to the code and see easily what part of the code does what. So basically the last thing I did was put a few paths into the main level and see if it worked. And well, as you can see, and it works great. It works great. Yeah. Okay, so it was a stressful week. Well, stress, I don't really suffer from stress, really, but it was a frustrating week, let's say that. Like, I was thinking the entire week of how to do it. Even while I was working, I was basically like thinking about how I could actually do it properly. And I was Googling in between work as well. And I'm actually so glad. Hours of work. I believe it was like 13 hours of footage I had from the creation thing. It was just too much. I spent way too much time on it, but I'm not really a programming guru. I didn't really like writing code myself because I really enjoy programming at the same time, but on the other hand, I don't really like it, if that makes sense. I learn very fast, that's the thing, but I just have so much trouble with programming. It's weird. You need so much knowledge about every little thing, basically, if you want to create proper code. So I'm glad Google and documentation actually worked. But yeah, actually that's all we got. We got the sprinting function and a working AI. Very simple, basic. So next week we're going back to creating the environment, just the basic things. So we're probably going to do the little sock area and maybe the plague tail area. So tower, trebuchet, tree with socks basically, and just socks scattered around the ground. And that's probably what we're gonna do next week. The week after, we're gonna finish the Stardew area and the Walking Dead area. I hope I can fit that in 1 week because that's gonna be a lot probably. Yeah, we'll see. We'll figure it out. But I believe if we keep this speed up, probably have to step up my game a little bit because I'm slacking in the weekends. Sorry. But yeah, if we can keep this up, we basically probably have like a working test version in 3 to 4 weeks. I'm very excited about that. We don't really have interiors and stuff yet, just walking, collecting pages, and see how the interaction between the player and the enemy goes. So that's the main thing I want to get right early on. So it's not too overpowered, really. But we'll figure that out. Next week we're going back to art. A little bit, also kind of frustrating at points, but a thing I have a better understanding of. It was a fun week. I'm actually very excited to continue with a working AI system so far. Yeah, thanks so much for watching. Again, follow MorgiCorgie. He's amazing. Please subscribe if you liked it. It means a lot, and you can keep up to date with the game. My very first little fun project, basically. Yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I'll hope to see you next week. Bye.